Yeah. All right, I'm going live now. What's up, everybody? Sorry about the little delay. We're gonna get started right here. Looks like we got one soul watching. We'll see who else comes in. Tonight we're gonna be doing some Dave McGowan content. Pretty excited. Checking all my levels, checking the lighting. Let me know if you guys can see and hear me, all that good stuff. So we're going to be talking about two different texts tonight. We're going to be talking about a little bit of weird scenes inside the canyon. We're just going to use this as a springboard to get into Program to Kill. Both books are written by Dave McGowan. Very interesting, fascinating scholar. You guys should check him out. So I did do an analysis of this already, and so we're not going to talk a whole lot about this, but we'll sort of, like I said, we'll use it as a springboard to get into Program to Kill. Now, the reason that these two works are kind of related, not only are they written by the same author, obviously, but they are sort of both dealing with phenomena in the media or in society and history that, according to Dave McGowan and some other sources, are sort of, there's definitely more than meets the eye, right? Like he says on the back of Program to Kill. And that some of these social movements, some of these tragedies that we see in history are co-opted, are almost created to a certain degree by entities such as maybe in the government or the military-industrial complex, or the medical industry in some cases, the CIA in some cases. So we'll sort of break down some of that information for you guys. I'll try to keep this relatively short. Maybe we'll try to keep it to maybe about an hour. We'll see how well we do. I know you all got some other things you want to get to this evening. So let's get into a little bit of weird scenes inside the canyon, which will be a nice sort of introduction to by the time we get to the covert operations and the serial killer stuff, serial murder, corruption in the legal system. We'll talk a little bit about that, but particularly with weird scenes inside the canyon, Dave McGowan presents his thesis or his overall philosophy that the 60s counterculture, sort of the burgeoning scene in Laurel Canyon, that it was not just the typical grassroots movement that you might associate with, the 60s counterculture itself, or maybe something like the grunge movement. There's definitely some room to speculate on the grunge era as well. Make sure you guys hit like, make sure, share this broadcast with your friends, leave me a comment. Let me know if you're interested in this whole, these sort of topics. So Dave McGowan presents this idea that a lot of the members of the musicians, whether it's from the Doors, like Jim Morrison's father was the admiral that started the Tonkin Gulf War, which is kind of strange, as well as the whole, a lot of the members of the 27 Club, as well as people of the band The Monkees, the Beach Boys, the Eagles, Flying Burrito Brothers, Frank Zappa. They almost all of them, if not directly, but through their family lineage, father, mother, grandparents, uncles, that sort of thing, have ties to the military-industrial complex and or CIA and or law enforcement of some kind. Just a lot of really strange connections, and just sort of the way that the whole 60s counterculture was kind of presented as this grassroots rebellion towards Vietnam. It's kind of odd because a lot of these people were sort of invested by a lot of their family members being in the military, being in the Navy, being in the armed forces. They were sort of invested in the whole war effort, not necessarily against it, not necessarily for the best interest of ending the war, right? And just sort of like his first chapter, he sort of goes on about Jim Morrison, how Jim Morrison sort of promoted this idea even that his parents were dead. Why did Jim Morrison never want to refer to his parents? Why did he never want to discuss his parents? Thank you for the 3 likes out there, y'all. Definitely appreciate you. What was actually going on there? He talks about this other creeper named Vito Polakis, who was sort of like this this music scene guru who sort of managed and sort of kept all these bands together. You guys can look him up on the internet, but he sort of ran these sort of secret sex clubs. No surprise, right? And so he sort of, just a little quick reference here. We'll quote him here. Says some readers might recognize many of these figures as the location of ominous mind control experiments conducted by the CIA under the rubric of MK Ultra. So some of these figures have ties to MK Ultra, or they have family members that were potentially participating in that whole thing. Maybe Jim Morrison was a result of MK Ultra, perhaps. Maybe that's why he decided to quote unquote rebel against his parents. Weird scenes inside the canyon is McGowan's taking a hammer to the icons and mythologies of 1960s counterculture, reducing them to dust, swept away by gusts of pomp and pretense and even deceit. With an encyclopedic knowledge of the Southern California rock scene, McGowan appears to be essentially declaring that the gods of his youth are dead. So that's what also makes this thesis interesting, is that a lot of these things that Dave McGowan is interested in, he's not trying to feed you a sort of a pro 60s music narrative. Although he's a fan, he can be fairly critical of these individuals, a lot of these sketchy enterprises that sort of took place. So the book sort of, in the beginning of it, sort of just I think the introduction is actually written by a man named Nick Bryant. I'm not sure who he is. But the first part of the book, like we were talking about, documents Jim Morrison and his sort of complex relationship with his father, but what was really going on there behind the scenes. Why did his father sort of, stage the whole, it says right here, before he was the Lizard King, U.S. Navy Admiral George Stephen Morrison and his son James Douglas Morrison on the bridge of the U.S. Hom Richard, January 1964. So just a little strange that, Jim Morrison's father was in the Navy, but by the time he's a famous rock star in the Doors, he sort of denounces his father. He never talks about his father. It's just a little bit odd to me and to Dave McGowan as well. And he sort of talks about what his father did in the military, sort of the connections that he had. He was definitely part of the, starting that fake war. In the first week of August 1964, U.S. warships under the command of U.S. Navy General Stephen Morrison, aka Jim Morrison's father, have allegedly come under attack while patrolling Vietnam's Tonkin Gulf. So he says allegedly because the Tonkin Gulf thing was obviously somewhat of a false flag, or at least that's the way it's been sort of interpreted, looking in hindsight, right? This event, subsequently dubbed the Tonkin Gulf Incident, will result in the immediate passings by the U.S. Congress of the obviously pre-drafted Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which will in turn quickly lead to America's deep immersion into a bloody Vietnam quagmire. So, of all people in the world, why is Jim Morrison's father one of the major players? Let me know what you guys think about that. It's a little bit odd. So he gets into some more of the stuff with Frank Zappa. You guys can do some Frank Zappa research. Covers Zappa, Morrison, the MK Ultra CIA connections, particularly with Frank Zappa's mother. And then here he gets into sort of the second chapter is called Power to the People. Call this a counterculture. So sort of critiquing that ideology that the 60s music movement or the 60s hippie movement was inherently anti-war, or that it was inherently, sort of from the ground up. It kind of makes sense, the whole, getting people hooked on LSD and listening to Jimi Hendrix or whatever. That's a good way to kind of keep people pacified while they fight the Vietnam War. And of course, a lot of those people sort of rebelled against Vietnam. So it wasn't like they were completely, not every single person that rebelled against the Vietnam War or that listened to the music. I'm not saying that the whole fan base was in on this sort of covert operation, but you can sort of see how they unleashed certain types of music, certain types of drugs, certain types of ideologies during that 60s time period, just to sort of experiment with the population. it's not necessarily that they knew what the end result was going to be either. And that's kind of when I have conversations with people about this, they say, well, why would they do this? Or who's behind the conspiracy? And how did they know that? And they don't necessarily know, but they are sort of experimenting with the populace. They want to see how people are going to behave. They want to see, how many people they can get to drop LSD and go to a Jimi Hendrix Doors concert. And they want to see, sort of maybe perhaps as a form of controlled opposition, they want to sort of be able to plant seeds, just like they do now with pop and rap music, for example, sort of corrupting the youth and rap music. They wanted to kind of see how they were going to be able to sort of plant seeds intellectually, politically, in the sort of the burgeoning, population, the younger generation, the generation that my mother grew up in. Even prior to that, maybe a little bit of my father's generation too, but especially by the time you get to the late 50s, all the way up to the 60s, we have this huge immersion of covert operations in the entertainment industry. And obviously this whole book is centered around Laurel Canyon, which is a little bit odd, not necessarily the place in itself, but why did all of these musicians know where to go? We've got Jackson Browne, we got James Taylor, we got Jim Morrison, Pamela Morrison, we got the Monkees. I think they were actually maybe part of the LA scene as well. But we've got the Beach Boys, we got the Turtles, we got, the Mamas and Papas, we got James Taylor, we got Joni Mitchell, we've got, all of these people. How did they kind of know that Laurel Canyon was the place to go? And why did Charles Manson just happen to be in that music scene in Laurel Canyon? It's a little odd. He was definitely part of the music scene as well, which they don't really tell you on the serial killer documentaries, but he's a quite talented musician, and we should have slapped him on the cover of the thumbnail with all those other mugshots, because Charles Manson and some of these other figures that come up later in Program to Kill were part of that Laurel Canyon scene. So how did they all know how to get there? Well, it's not a coincidence. Most of them, their parents were in the military, and somehow, we talked about in the Marilyn Monroe documentary, the Lookout Mountain just happened to be there where they conducted covert military-industrial complex operations at this sort of secret place called Lookout Mountain. And obviously there might have been, there's probably some naval bases there, some military training bases as well. But, why is it that a good majority of these individuals, just the sheer number of them that have connections to the military, it's a little bit odd. And I guess you could speculate that, it was, the late 50s and the 60s, and everybody's parents were patriotic, everybody's parents were in the military. Who knows? So my annotation here says 60s Canyon community similar to the sex cults, aka Manson, because we have that connection. He talks about this cult leader, Vito Palakis, who sort of orchestrated a lot of these secret LSD parties, was definitely privy to some of the murders that took place. He probably knew what Charles Manson was up to. And he's got this one chapter here where he basically just kind of talks about all the strange connection that all of these sort of people have with each other, which is sort of ironic, and how they're all connected, or just weird things that come up about them sort of in general. Skipping ahead a little bit here. Trying to see if I can find a good quote for you guys. So also we have this individual, a lot of individuals here, like this part here, it says, quite possibly rubbed shoulders with he's talking about the musicians in Laurel Canyon. He said many of these people rubbed shoulders with the likes of Peter Fonda, Jack Nicholson, Bruce Dern, Dennis Hopper, and Warren Beatty, along with their female counterparts such as Jane Fonda, Nancy Sinatra, and Sharon Tate, who were we just talking about a couple days ago on the Marilyn Monroe conspiracy thing. Frank Sinatra, now we got Nancy Sinatra, obviously Sharon Tate needs no introduction. We know what ended up happening to her. We know a little bit about Creeper Kinko Nicholson as well as Creeper Hopper. And you can definitely see how intertwined the music community in Laurel Canyon was with the entertainment Hollywood industry. By the time we get to the sort of the Helter Skelter era with Charles Manson, you can definitely see how they're all sort of interconnected, and they're all sort of not necessarily. I'm not saying every single celebrity, but at least the ones mentioned here, and probably more that you could uncover, or sort of definitely involved in these cult-like covert operations. Um, there's sort of like this director. I forgot what his name was, but he was sort of like a satanic director, and what's sort of alleged in you know weird scenes inside the canyon. My brain's running a little slow. I have been having migraines all day. Is that this satanic movie director sort of he was raising his son, but allegedly his son like fell off of a chandelier or a balcony. Just a lot of really strange deaths in and around Laurel Canyon. He talks about the origins of LSD. He talks about Jack Nicholson's strange origins. And again, I'll link the Laurel Can or the book review, or the book analysis rather, that we did of this in the description below after we get done with the stream, so you guys can kind of check that out, get some more information on it. Lo and behold, Emily Lou Harris has military connections here. Emily Lou Harris, a relatively late arrival to the Laurel Canyon scene. Harris was the daughter of, brace yourselves here for a real shocker, folks, of a career U.S. Marine Corps officer. As with so many other characters in the story, she grew up in the outlying suburbs of Washington, D.C., primarily in Woodbridge, Virginia. And Northern Virginia, that real sort of elite military section or that area rather of Virginia, also, bears people like Dave Grohl has connections to, the military and Virginia as well. Very odd. He actually ended up in Laurel Canyon right around the time that they don't really talk about it, but he had sort of a secret refuge, Dave Grohl, in Laurel Canyon, where he was living with strippers. And so that whole sort of rags to riches story about Dave Grohl and Kurt Cobain living together and eating corn dogs, it's just not really true. There's a little more to it than that. So Charles Manson sort of functions as, and the reason we're bringing up Manson is because he's going to come in to Program to Kill, obviously later by the time we get to it. And like I said, we'll kind of keep weird seeds inside the canyons pretty quick. We're about halfway through this text now. Manson sort of functions as this whistleblower not the whistleblower, but a whistleblower sort of found him sort of in a lot of these situations, and they would sort of they would sort of breadcrumb the public about Charles Manson just to sort of get people interested and invested and sort of afraid of the crimes that were taking place in Laurel Canyon, but they were sort of made to go on and on and on until Manson was sort of finally caught. And a lot of these people knew what he was up to as well. It says here, I know why Charles Manson did what he did. It says, this is Dennis. Who is this? Somebody by the name of Dennis Wilson. I think that's the guy from the Beach Boys, right? I know why Charles Manson did what he did, said Dennis. Someday I'll tell the world. I'll write a book and explain why he did it. That book, however, was never written, of course, and Wilson's story, if indeed he had one, was never told. Instead, Dennis Wilson drowned under questionable circumstances on December 28, 1983, in the marina where his beloved yacht had previously been docked. So again, another strange death in connection with Charles Manson. You really start to scratch your head and wonder, why do these musicians have so many problems? I know one of the guys from the Beach Boys ended up in a mental institution, and he had like a handler that sort of like mentally tortured him for long periods of time. Chapter 12 is a little bit about the Doors. And then he gets into Aldous Huxley a little bit. Talks a little bit about JFK. Talks about sort of Houdini. Interestingly enough, obviously has ties to the intelligence agency. So what my annotation actually says here is Dave McGowan goes on this monologue about the guy from the Beatles, Brian Wilson, had this technique of being able to sort of miraculously compose and write songs, come up with riffs, but while composing, Brian appeared strangely absent, as if he were functioning less as a conscious artist than than as some sort of antenna. Like a lot of these people were supposedly just really, really brilliantly gifted, which is maybe partially true, but my annotation sort of references here possible musical talent derived from some type of CIA mind control technique or grooming. Maybe these people were sort of used their musical talent as some form of escapism, sort of like a form of like covert narcissism, perhaps. There was like one way that they could escape the abuse that they endured. That's what I kind of suspect what happened to Jim Morrison. Because his upbringing is just, there's what little we know about it, has ties to the military. So if he was rebelling against his father, which is maybe partly true, why did he not necessarily, and even if you listen to some of the Doors music, like Unknown Soldier or When the Music's Over, he's sort of towing the line between rejecting sort of his not his family history with the military, but sort of his perceptions of maybe the Vietnam War and just warfare in general. He's sort of towing that line between pro-war and anti-war, and can any of these musicians, or any of these bands rather, really be considered anti-war really in that sense? Dave McGowan kind of breaks down a lot of the songs in here, and a lot of the so maybe they were on the surface level, right? They were maybe anti-war, but if you look a little bit deeper, they were sort of invested in the war effort. Whether or not they wanted the U.S. to win, or whether they wanted Vietnam to win, they were sort of by default invested in the war effort by their parents or by their immediate family members. So that's interesting as well. Towards the end of this, it starts tying into his next book. I think this is his most recent book, so I say his next book as in the next book that we're going to talk about, but I think this was written prior to this. So just a little quick intro. Like I said, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time, but hopefully some of those little monologues that we did, some of these little chapter sequences will sort of prepare you sort of what we're going to get into with Program to Kill. Now, very similar to Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, the serial killer sort of phenomenon, the serial killer trauma that is sort of forced upon the public. You got to ask yourself, how do these people get away with these things for so long? How can some of these serial killers, how do they manage to travel all the way across the country? How can they be in 2 and 3 different places at once? And the answer is, it could be some type of covert operation. We'll get into that here. The first chapter, let me see if I can read you a little synopsis of the back of it. In Program to Kill, acclaimed and always controversial author Dave McGowan takes a fresh look at the lives of many of America's most notorious murderers, focusing on the largely hidden patterns that suggest that there may be more to the average killer than meets the eye, like we sort of said in the thumbnail. Think you know everything there is to know about serial killers, or is it possible that sometimes what everyone knows to be true isn't really true at all? So he's not really telling you exactly what he's going to get into, but he gets into it here. And we did talk a little bit about the mind control thing when we did our Britney Spears analysis, and that's what this first chapter is documenting. It's called Mind Control 101. And he sort of uses that as a springboard and as a potential answer to what's going on with a lot of these alleged serial killers. A lot of them have given confessions that they grew up in mysterious satanic cults like Otis Toole, Henry Lee Lucas. We don't even have to begin with Ted Bundy's strange origins, and he grew up thinking his mother was like, his aunt was his mother or something crazy like that. His father, there's speculation on who his actual real father is to this day. So mind control, as I'm not going to, this is not going to be a whole stream about live mind control, but you can see where mind control is a good potential tool, maybe used by some of these covert entities. I'm saying if this is all true, I'm not saying it's 100% true, but it kind of makes sense that if you break people at a young age, they're going to grow up to be, monsters, right? And how do they do that? Is through sort of the vessel of mind control. Dissociative states, that's a good way to create a monster as well. Put somebody under extreme abuse or some type of cult-like behavior like Henry Lee Lucas claims to grow up in. satanic sacrifices and all that. And by the time, they reach a certain age, they're ready to sort of reenact that, as they were sort of programmed to allegedly do. So the first chapter kind of documents mind control. He talks a little bit about Marilyn Monroe. He talks a little bit about, other authors that he's, talks a little bit about hypnotism. It's a good tool to use if you want to get somebody under mind control. Satanic ritual abuse, talks about that. Now he also too, what a lot of victims on both sides of the spectrum, whether they're victims of serial, like people that have escaped from serial killers, or the serial killer confessions themselves, largely their information regarding what they experience has been discredited. But he says here, there has been a tremendous amount of energy expended to discredit all such stories of satanic abuse. At the forefront of the movement to deny the validity of the stories told by countless survivors of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, for example, a group led by a truly vile coalition of CIA-funded psychiatrists and accused, and in many cases, I'm not going to say that word because I don't want to get demonetized, but I think you guys get the idea. Also playing a key role in the movement are Paul and Shirley Erbile, the authors of the purportedly authoritative book entitled The Politics of Child Abuse. I don't want to say that word. Los Angeles police distributors of, again, child balagala, I don't want to say that word, a fact that media outlets conveniently and rather consistently ignore while touting this particular family as authorities in the field. So sort of like the Alfred Kinsey thing. If you guys are familiar with Alfred Kinsey, you'll know that he wrote in-depth articles, in-depth books about the nature of sexuality among adults, like middle-aged people, and then adolescents, and then it gets even worse after that. So Alfred Kinsey, he was real big buddies with Hugh Hefner. So you got to ask yourself, the sexual revolution, the 60s counterculture, the serial killer movements, if you look at the players that are all kind of involved in it, and that's another tool that the sort of these covert operations use, that they'll use like legit psychiatrists. It kind of reminds me of that reverend that was sort of running that really vile abortion program. He was like real tight with the Clintons back in the 90s, early 2000s. I think he covers him a little bit in this. But they'll use these high-profile doctors, psychiatrists, therapists, hypnotists, sort of pseudo doctorate sort of people in order to sort of do secret research. And on the surface level, they're doing like normal everyday research for the continuation of mankind. But underneath it, they're basically doing covert research, using children as victims. So the first part of the book I'm not going to cover because it's pretty much all about stuff that happens to children, which I don't really want to get into in this live stream. Talks about the pedo rings and all that stuff. It's good information to kind of know about, and how it's talks about Alfred Kinsey here. The professor was, oddly enough, another devoted disciple of Aleister Crowley. Alfred Kinsey died shortly after paying a visit to Crowley's Themela Abbey in Sicily with filmmaker and fellow occultist Kenneth Anger, who was the roommate and probable lover of Manson family member Bobby Bucelel. But we will get to that later. So again, you got Aleister Crowley, you got Manson, you got Alfred Kinsey. I mean, it's just crazy that these people are all connected. So here's just a little bit more in depth of what we were discussing. I'm not going to I don't want to read too much from the text because it's, it might not make sense in context, but he's sort of saying here, law enforcement, kind of like we talked about with the Marilyn Monroe LAPD covert operations, says law enforcement are frequently in collusion with the traffickers and exploiters and victims who seek to escape or return to their captors by those from whom they sought protection. Their despondency and despair is beyond description. He talks about how the human trafficking can really only exist as sort of this covert collusion enterprise with a lot of different sort of secret players. How far does this underground ring extend into the halls of power? Are America's political, corporate, and military elite, like those counterparts in Belgium, Latvia, and Portugal, hiding a particularly dirty secret from the American people? Probably. A secret that, if exposed, could shatter America's cherished political and economic institutions, and bring the house of cards crashing down. Consider the case of Craig Spacey, a behind-the-scenes Republican power broker in Washington. In June 1989, the Washington Times published a story that sent shockwaves rippling across Capitol Hill. It seems that Spence had been deeply involved with a call boy ring that supplied people, some of them very young, to the elite of both political parties, as well as visiting dignitaries. So both political sides of the spectrum are probably involved in this. And we got Kinko Biden sniffing up, little kids at his press conferences. And of course, we've got Donald Trump, messing around with Stormy Daniels. I wouldn't be surprised if maybe he was on Epstein Island with Kinko Biden and Kinko Epstein, all those figures. My annotation down here says the elites control through blackmail by companions. So sort of what we're seeing with the Stormy Daniel thing, or when we talked about the Russian collusion thing, sort of these political deities, these people in high positions of power, have tremendous amount of blackmail on each other, right? And that's probably why maybe Trump and Putin are so tight. Maybe that's why Biden is very, very tight with certain individuals that he's tight with, because they all kind of have dirt on each other, right? Fast forwarding a little bit. So let's get past the first couple chapters, and we'll start getting into what the topic of the stream is. Chapter 7 is about Henry Lee Lucas. It says here. Okay, so this is kind of interesting too. Like Henry Lee Lucas, for example, a lot of serial killers, they'll be up for the death penalty, right? But then some new investigator comes in, or some new evidence allegedly pops up, and a lot of these individuals are taken back from the the death penalty to sort of buy the whole system more time. They want to do more investigating. They want to do more, covert operations. Perhaps they want to, sort of deceive the public a little bit more. They want to, like George Bush here, for example, was part of the. Says given the advocacy of the death penalty by then Governor George Bush, things have not been looking good for Henry. Henry would fare far worse, particularly since his crimes were of a particular brutal nature, involving monstrous acts, cannibalism, necrophilia, etc. What seems certain is that Lucas, frequently working with erstwhile partner Otis Toole, a self-described arsonist and cannibal, savagely murdered dozens of victims of various ages, races, and genders. All indications were then that Henry's execution was a foregone conclusion. But sort of the way that the trials work and the prison systems work, they'll sort of push and pull them. They'll kind of titillate the serial killer too. They'll put him up for the death penalty, and then they'll take him off the death penalty, and then it's just kind of like this game of tug of war. Was Henry Lee Lucas just extraordinarily lucky to have his only death sentence set aside by a governor who handed out all but one commutation? Or was there something more at work in the Lucas case? Surely there had to be some reason why Bush would take uncharacteristic action to spare the life of a man who had led a life of such brutality. So again, when Bush was like a governor back then in Texas, he was sort of taking serial killers off of the death penalty. And this was certainly not the first time the criminal justice system had shown such inexplicable leniency towards Lucas. And Henry Lee Lucas in particular is interesting because he was let out of prison so many times, several times in fact, an ungodly amount of times. Lucas served just 4 years again before being granted an early release, this time in August 1975. beginning shortly after and continuing for nearly 8 years. Henry and his old friend Otis Toole committed an untold number of lurid murders. Henry was finally arrested not until 1982 on a suspicion of committing 2 murders, but he was promptly released. He was not arrested again for the last time until June 1983. And if you're familiar with Otis Toole and Henry Lee Lucas, you'll know that they were like homosexual lovers, but they also, like, one of Henry Lee Lucas's crimes, he actually confessed to one of the fathers at the gas station that he murdered, and he said, I was there when your father was murdered, but I didn't kill your father. The hands of death killed your father. So who is the hands of death? Dave McGowan pretty much gets into what he suspects is the hands of death. And it sounds crazy, but it says here, the hands of death, the Henry Lee Lucas story tells of Henry's indoctrination into a nationwide satanic cult. Lucas claimed that he was trained by the cult in a mobile paramilitary training camp in Florida, Everglades. His training, he said, included instruction in abduction and arson techniques, as well as in the fine art of killing up close and personal. Very weird. It kind of reminds me of the Phoenix program, where they would, during Vietnam, where they would basically give, I think it was Vietnam, but anyway, the Phoenix program, where they would sort of let soldiers have access to unadulterated violence in order to, obviously, to get the opponent to submit, but also they were sort of creating monsters. And by the time those soldiers come back from participating in the Phoenix program, they're like ready to be full-fledged serial killers, right? Because they're so used to that violence. The military serves as a really good way, at least the active, bloodshed type of military. I'm not talking about all forms of the military, but like the combat zone serves as a great way to create some of the monsters that we've seen in society, and a lot of them have ties to the military or history of in the armed forces. So anyway, getting back to Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole, he confessed that he was in this cult. Nobody really believed him. He said the hands of death. Well, what the hell is the hands of death? But if you look at the evidence of how Henry Lee Lucas grew up, his mother abused him. She had sex in front of him. She made him have sex with animals and so on and so forth. So you can kind of, although the information is not presented in the mainstream narrative as that he grew up in a cult, if you really look deeper into it, it kind of makes sense. But this stuff is so covertly hidden that it's just not easy to really find those connections. What Henry claimed, essentially, is that what appeared to be the random work of a serial killer was in fact a planned series of crimes often committed for specific purposes. Some of the murders were political hits, according to Henry, including assassinations of foreign dignitaries, local politicians, as well as wealthy businessmen. And Henry's version of events, it was Toole who was responsible for Henry's recruitment and training by the cult and for many of the pair's exploits thereafter. So just really interesting monologues about Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole. It says Lucas also suffered through an incomprehensible abusive childhood, like we just mentioned. In fact, when it comes to early childhood abuse, there are few parents of future serial killers who can compare to Viola Lucas. So who was Henry Lee Lucas's mother? It remains to be seen. Henry's other stories, including the one about being close friend of Jim Jones of the People's Temple, Henry claimed on numerous occasions that it was he who was taken on a chartered plane to Guyana to personally deliver the cyanide to Jones that was allegedly used in the now infamous Jonestown. Now, Henry Lee Lucas could have been trolling. Obviously, he confessed to, 400 or 500 crimes that he probably didn't commit. But once they sort of had these serial killers, that's another thing you'll see throughout this book and just throughout the serial killer phenomenon, is that they encourage these serial killers by fame and sort of clout to confess to a completely ridiculous amount of crimes, a whole slew of crimes that they couldn't have possibly committed. Chapter 8 is called Portrait of MK Ultra Assassin. A U.S. Navy psychologist claims that the Office of Naval Intelligence had taken convicted murderers from military prisons, used behavior modification techniques on them, and then relocated them in American embassies throughout the world. The Navy psychologist was Lieutenant Commander Thomas Nerat of the U.S. Regional Medical Center in Naples, Italy. So that's another possibility. That's kind of what we talked about, how they'll pluck certain individuals from the armed forces, from the Navy, from different various recruitment offices, and put them in America after they're maybe psychologically damaged, or maybe they place certain people in the American sort of scene to sort of recruit other members that might be good for their cult. Fast forwarding a little bit here. Now, here's where the whole issue of the covert, are serial killers actually operating alone? The Monster of Florence may have been a satanic sect bankrolled by the Secret Service. And it kind of makes sense. If we're talking about somebody like the Zodiac Killer, right? I mean, what other explanation could you possibly offer? People getting shot in the middle of the night, getting shot in the dark, a weirdo writing letters, to the police office, confessing to the crime, saying you'll never find me, saying I'm going to do this, I'm going to do A and B and such the next couple of months. All of a sudden they disappear. Serial killers don't normally just disappear. Usually eventually they're found. But you got to ask yourself, who's sort of helping disguise these serial killers, these alleged serial killers? And a lot of people are probably scratching their head. Well, why would the CIA or the military or the law enforcement or these covert operations? Why would they create or unleash serial killers? Well, you got to think about it in a lot of different ways. Not only from the legal system perspective, but just from how the media is sort of oftentimes in collusion with with law enforcement, obviously with the government, so they can sort of terrorize the public and sort of create media to a certain degree. They want to be able to create this. That's almost like a form of mind control in itself, is turning on the news and constantly seeing violence, constantly seeing trauma. You're sort of regurgitating this trauma and talking about it with your friends and living in fear and being paranoid and all that stuff. So it kind of works as this like big satanic covert cycle, right? Got more connections to, so they got these sketchy ranches out in New Mexico and like the Texas area where there's a lot of strange covert Satanism going on out there. A lot of these serial killers mentioned in this book have connections to these locations, to these mysterious places in Mexico City. Mexico City newspapers openly speculated that human infants had been ritually sacrificed by the group. Some reporters opened that babies might have been bred specifically for that purpose. A lot of people have come out on the internet about satanic abuse. Of course, we had the whole thing with the satanic panic back in the 80s. Some of it was obviously false, but some of it wasn't false. There were also a number of law enforcement personnel within this cult, including Salvador Vidal Garcia, a Mexico City federal judicial police agent who was in charge of narcotics investigations. Mexican federales burned down the death shed at Ranchero Santa Elena, destroying a wealth of valuable evidence. So that's another thing is that you'll see too, like sort of like the whole JonBenet Ramsey thing, that they, not only was it a huge media spectacle psyop. I mean, I'm not saying she wasn't killed. Obviously she was, but it was sort of a concocted murder, sort of in collusion with not only the media, but obviously the dark entities that killed her. But you'll see how the police were allowed to go in and completely botch the JonBenet Ramsey investigation. Because if they botch it, if they sort of destroy all the evidence, like when John Ramsey found his daughter in the basement and fucked up the crime scene by picking her up and walking her upstairs and dropping her on the kitchen floor. I mean, who fucking does that? And the reason that was allowed and never really questioned, I mean, it was questioned initially, but that's how you botch an investigation, right? So just more about these satanic cults in Mexico. And then we have Lucas in context. Okay, and this is kind of what's getting to the meat and potatoes of what we're referring to. Most Americans are probably familiar with what is considered the classic killer profile. This was a notion first put forth by the venerable FBI, which coined the term serial killer and pioneered the concept of profiling. In an alleged attempt to understand the phenomenon of a mass murder, it appears to be the case through though, that the concept of serial killer profile was put forth largely to misinform the public, because there really is no profile in that sense. On the case of Henry Lee Lucas, few, if any, of the elements of the serial killer profile appear. Or apply, for instance, serial killers are said to act alone, driven to do so only by their own private demons. So far removed from ordinary human behavior are their actions that they would not, indeed could not, share their private passions with others. In Henry's case, this is primarily a false notion. It has been officially acknowledged that Lucas worked with not just one, but at times as many as 3 accomplices. Again, Ottis Toole and whoever with those other unnamed accomplices. Toole's preteen niece and nephew were frequently brought along to witness and at times participate in the crimes of Henry and Ottis Toole. It is also claimed that serial killers target a particular type of victim similar to age, gender, race, etc., hairstyle, and other physical attributes. In Henry's case, this simply does not fit the known facts. And we actually did that analysis of American Predator, the Israel Keys bioptic. You guys should check out the video we did on that, because Israel Keys is definitely one of the strangest serial killers I've ever heard of, and it kind of makes you wonder. It's just like the things that make you go hum. If you guys are not convinced that there's a little more to involvement in the actions of serial killers, look into Israel Keys. Look up the video we did about a year ago now on Israel Keys. They do have cannibalistic rituals. Sometimes they'll eat, serial killers will eat. Jeffrey Dahmer, basically. We don't need to get into that, but he gets into him later. Notably, this precisely mirrors... So he's talking about... I forgot what he was getting into here, but he says, notably, this precisely mirrors the means by which the CIA has historically taught its assassins to kill. CIA training manual entitled A Study of Assassination advises the would-be killer the simplest local tools are often the most efficient means of assassination: hammer, axe, wench, screwdriver, fire, poker, kitchen knife. All such improved weapons have the important advantage of availability and apparent innocence. The assassin may accidentally be searched before the act and should not carry any incriminating device. The Mafia assassination service known as Murder Incorporated, the brainchild of the Lansky-Luciano syndicate, which had extensive connections to U.S. intelligence agencies, had a remarkably similar philosophy. So he's just sort of talking about the alleged randomness of a lot of serial murder. Apparently, there's CIA assassin manuals that sort of instruct people in the same manner, which is kind of odd. Shout out to y'all out there watching, supporting. I really appreciate you. We've been on almost an hour here. We're going to try to wrap it up in a little while here. I want to take up too much of your all's time. 8 o'clock. So we have the idea of the false profiles and the Hand of Death cult. Henry Lee recounts in The Hand of Death that his training by the Hand of Death cult followed the same time-honored tradition. Of course, the FBI assures us that satanic cults and satanic crimes do not exist in modern-day America. So they don't really want, whoever they is, whether it's law enforcement in particular or CIA or some of these rogue entities, the powers that be, as I like to tell my dad, they don't want you to really know that these serial killers are not necessarily always acting alone. And yes, some of them are. I'm not saying that every criminal across the board is in a satanic, CIA cult, but you got to ask yourself, it's like this too. It is also the same FBI that for years ignored and denied the resurgence of the KKK in the early part of the 20th century. The FBI, in other words, has a long history of denying the existence of threatening groups devoted to terrorizing American society. So interesting. Contrary to conventional wisdom, a small caliber round to the head is more often fatal than a larger caliber bullet. You'll see that often too. That there's certain weapons that are used in a lot of these murders. Fast forwarding a little bit to Bundy. In the case of Ted Bundy, it is frequently claimed that all of his purported victims were remarkably similar in appearance, which is not 100% true like they necessarily say. Many of the books chronicling Bundy's alleged exploits reinforce the notion by including a carefully selected set of photos of the slain women who did resemble one another to a limited degree. Overall, though, the victims varied widely in height, weight, build, and attractiveness, and hairstyle. I think that's interesting, too. Bundy was sort of even my parents used to tell me like he had a victim profile. He only, victimized pretty women that had long, straight black hair or something, whatever it was. But obviously, he deviated from that continuously throughout his murder spree. And something else you'll find with a lot of these serial killers, the ones not like obviously people like, John Wayne Gacy or fucking Jeffrey Dahmer, they were kind of like homebody serial killers, right? Like everything they did was at their house. But these other people like Otis Toole or Ted Bundy or the Green River Killer, they always have mysterious sort of pilgrimages that they make across the U.S., which I think is strange. If these serial killers they're so busy that they don't have a job, like Israel Keys. Going back to Israel Keys for a second, how do these serial killers have so much darn time on their hands? It's a little suspicious to me. Where are they getting gas money? Where are they getting from point A to point B? And oftentimes they'll go to the similar locations like the Midwest, or they'll go to Colorado or Nebraska to revisit their crime scenes. Just a little bit odd. So I'm jumping a mile a minute here. Something interesting here. In the early morning hours of February 16, 1999, 3 women allegedly were abducted from the room at the Cedar Lodge, which lies just outside the west gate to Yosemite National Park. If you guys are familiar with Missing 411 and Dave Paulides, you'll know that there's something going on over in the national parks. Following the abduction, Parnell and Strainer lived for a time in Yosemite. I don't know why I can't speak tonight. Where Parnell worked at the Yosemite Lodge, which happened to be located just a few hundred yards from the home of Carrie and Stevenson's grandfather. So, I don't want to digress into the national park disappearances, but it's possible that there's some covert operations going on in our national parks. It would not surprise me. So he pretty much covers any serial killer you can possibly think of. They're all listed on the front here. Ed Kemper, Ted Bundy, Gary Heidnik, Angelo Buono, Charles Manson, Richard Speck, Bobby Joe Long, Henry. Pretty much all the major ones are discussed here. Just a little bit about some texts that pop up with some of these murderers as well. Aleister Crowley. Manson's connection to the music scene. It gets a little bit into the Laurel Canyon stuff here with Manson and all the weird stuff that was going on out there. It says here's a little interview from Otis Toole and Henry Lee Lucas. Otis Toole says, "I've been meaning to ask you, Lucas, that time when I cooked some of these people, why did I do that?" Henry Lee Lucas says, "I think it was just the hands of death doing it. I know a lot of things we've done in human sight are impossible to believe." Toole responds, "When we took him out and cut him up, remember one time I said I wanted me some ribs? Did that make me a cannibal?" Lucas says, "You wasn't a cannibal. It's the force of the devil. Something forced on us that we can't change. There's no reason denying what we become. We know what we are." So then he discusses the Zodiac Killer, but you can sort of see how these Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole in particular are they have this infantile mindset, and they're like, well, how did we end up like this? Was it because we were in this cult? And nobody's ever gotten to the bottom of what that cult was in, is because they're so mentally damaged that they don't even really remember. They can't even speak on maybe some of the people in positions of power that were in the cult, or who influenced this cult, who sort of indoctrinated them, all that sort of stuff. He talks about the sketchy Zodiac Killer. A wristwatch of military origin has been found at the crime scene, along with military-style heel print. The circumstances of the murder suggested that the female victim knew her killer and spent a portion of the evening with him before the attack. Very strange here. Obviously, with the letters from the Zodiac, the series of letters were laced with codes that suggested that the writer had a background in naval intelligence, bringing the ONI Official Office of Naval Intelligence onto the case. So very weird. You sort of see this with serial killers too. They'll get sort of, like the Navy, they'll get the Naval Intelligence, Bureau sort of involved. They'll get the FBI involved. They'll get the military industrial complex involved. So you sort of get this idea that if not in collusion, they sort of all speak the same language in terms of how they're sort of reviewing and analyzing these crimes, right? Which I think is interesting. So, obviously nobody ever caught the Zodiac killer. See if we can find another good quote here. So he's skipping ahead. He covers Manson a little bit of the Laurel Canyon thing. There's actually speculation that there's like implants given to people that, they can sort of control people mentally via these implants. Not sure how true that is. Fast forward to some of the more interesting stuff here. So he talks a little bit about Bundy, and obviously if you guys are familiar with Bundy, you'll know that sometimes he would have a long beard, sometimes he would have short hair, sometimes he looked real bummy, other times he looked real made up. So Bundy was sort of like a changeling, what Dave McGowan describes as sort of like a changeling, which is kind of strange in the sense that it could be like a trauma response, or it could be like, what the cult was telling him to do. But also what's interesting about Bundy in particular is that if you guys are familiar with Bundy, you'll know a lot of books were written by him by this woman named, I think her name is, what's her name? Anne Rule, I want to say it is. That's not the vampire lady, is it? No, that's Anne Rice. Why are all these serial killer and vampire esoteric? You got Anne Rice, Anne Rule. Who's that other lady that writes about the werewolves? Anne Jackson or something. So anyway, he had this sort of strange covert relationship with his future biography, which I find a little suspicious. Bundy and Anne Rule allegedly worked at like a suicide crisis hotline together, and he would sit next to Bundy for like several months, if not years, getting to know Bundy very in-depthly. And then after Bundy's crimes come out, she wrote a book called The Stranger Beside Me, as if she knew nothing about Bundy. And there's some other strange things about Anne Rule as well. Just a little bit strange. Just a little too many coincidences, if you ask me. He talks about John Wayne Gacy here. Here's what we were talking about earlier. Like John Wayne Gacy, for example, was given break after break after break in the judicial law enforcement system almost for many years. Almost, you could argue he was hardly ever held accountable until it was too late. So why are these law enforcement agencies letting these alleged serial killers get away with this stuff for so long? It's mind-boggling. While in prison, he somehow managed to always have money, cigars, and civilian shirts, all difficult commodities to attain for most prisoners. Maybe his creeper mother was putting a lot of money on the books for him or something, or maybe they were trying to prop him up to get that serial killer ego status, so that he could, they could get more information out of him too. According to some reports, Gacy received electroshock and aversion therapy while incarcerated, allegedly to cure him of his homosexuality. So that's kind of weird too, how you can just understand that the jail systems are sort of in cahoots with the people that are performing hypnosis or electroshock therapy, or they're giving people medicine. It's just a little bit odd. They're not necessarily trying to rehabilitate these people 100%. They're almost trying to, dare I say, create monsters so that they can, have somebody to keep locked up, I guess. Or in some cases, they'll let the serial killer go out and have a free ride for a certain amount of time until, through the court of public opinion, then they'll decide we got to lock somebody up. Interesting. Just some stuff about his crimes. The possibility exists that Gacy was not actually able to do all these murders alone, although he was clearly capable of hurting helpless victims. Perhaps, as his initial statements to police indicated, there were others involved in the actual killings, and Gacy's house was just a convenient place to dispose of the bodies. So that's something else you got to ask yourself with Bundy or Gacy or Jeffrey Dahmer. It's like, how does one man do all of this? Number one, how does he have that much time on his hands? Number two, how is he never caught? Number three, how does he have the funds? You know, and even Bundy flirted with the fact that some of the photographs that were taken at the crime scene that he allegedly took, they were allegedly lost by the FBI or whoever lost them. And Bundy said something to the effect of, well, maybe they lost them because they didn't want to see anybody else in these photos except for me, because he's sort of alleging, he's sort of like spilling the beans on the facts that there could have been some other bad actors at these dumping grounds. Very strange. While it was abundantly clear that Gacy was involved in the abductions, it seems unlikely that he was acting alone. So that's kind of the whole meat and potatoes of what we've been trying to get to. Also very strange, too. He gets back into Bundy here. He talks about Ann Rule. Chronicler Ann Rule has written that the identity of Ted's real father was unknown outside of the family, and that he was a shadowy man whose real identity grows more blurred within every year. Throughout his life, Bundy described the church deacon, father, grandfather in glowing terms, while other family members have characterized him as a horrendously violent and abusive man. Ted often traveled to Florida to attend the Republican National Convention as a supporter of a presidential candidate, Nelson Rockefeller. At about that same time, he worked as a driver and bodyguard for Art Fletcher, a candidate for lieutenant governor in the state of Washington. The real reason for Bundy's stay in Absent, Colorado remains unknown. He has also paid a visit to Arkansas that year, reportedly to visit relatives. So that's something else that comes up with serial killers, is that they have unaccounted vacations, they have travels that are kind of unaccounted for, as if somebody is funding these enterprises. And what's also strange is that Bundy was like involved in sort of the local political sphere, the national political sphere. He's endorsing Republican candidates. He's sort of represented. He's studying law, right? You never hear about this stuff. Says here, this is when it gets into Ann Rule. In 1971, Bundy began working at a Seattle crisis clinic. As a paid work-study student, he remained there until 1972. His work partner at the clinic was none other than biographer Ann Rule, a policewoman, true crime reporter whose brother had been recently killed allegedly by his own hand at where else? Stanford University. Ted left the crisis center to intern at Harborview County Hospital as a psychiatric counselor. His salary there was funded by a federal grant. He also worked that year as a key organizer of Washington Governor Dan Evans' re-election campaign. His job specifically was to spy and gather intelligence on the governor's opponent. So Ted Bundy himself as a potential covert operative, the local collegiate and university psychiatric center was like endorsing and hiring Bundy for covert operations, with Ann Rule, who went on to write some of the most well-known biographers of Bundy. A little weird. While conspiracy theories attempting to explain the phenomenon abound, such theories frequently involving experimentation through aliens, many police investigators and independent researchers have linked these occurrences to local satanic cult activity. So a lot of times what people allege is like a UFO abduction could be maybe they're being drugged by some type of covert, cult. One particular lady who disappeared around this time, both were later identified only by skulls that were found on Taylor Mountain. Ball was not reported missing for 2.5 weeks following her purported abduction. She was, curiously enough, an acquaintance of Bundy himself and chronicler Ann Rule's daughter. So a lot of Ted Bundy's victims have connections to Bundy himself, which you don't actually hear about. So anyway, he talks about how Bundy was caught and sort of apprehended and stuff. We're going to fast forward here. So we talked about the strange travel. Let's see here. How the chronically broke and underemployed Long. He's talking about some guy named serial killer named Long. I forgot what his first name is, but this kind of goes back to what I was saying, the unaccounted for travels of serial killers. How the chronically broke and underemployed killers were able to finance the driving lessons as well as the trips themselves have never been explained, nor has his sudden interest in driving, which was apparently of no interest to him before or after his trip to California. So just a little monologue about, you know, some missing pieces there. Then he goes on this monologue about Richard Ramirez. Richard has a cousin that's linked to the Phoenix program, oddly enough, covert ops in Vietnam where they would torture people, bring them back. Richard was born in 1960 to Julian Mercedes Ramirez. Julian endured repeated beatings by both his father and his grandfather before growing up to become a policeman in, of all places, Juarez, Mexico. He eventually left the Juarez force and relocated the family to El Paso, Texas, where he continued to visit several times a week with his police friends. Julian reportedly had an explosive temper that sometimes, so he's just talking about his father. I want to get a little bit of the covert stuff here. Richard had an older cousin named Mike who was being something of a mentor to the young Richard. In 1965, Mike was sent to Vietnam where he appears to have functioned as a Phoenix assassin. Talked about the Phoenix program earlier. After 2 hours of duty and 29 confirmed kills, he returned a hero. Strange, covert military operations creating monsters. His souvenirs from the Phoenix time in the Phoenix program included 8 shrunken heads that he made himself and a large collection of Polaroid photos that graphically depicted gruesome acts. These he gleefully shared with the young Richard Ramirez while regaling him with tales of barbaric treatment of the Vietnamese people. Mike also taught young Richard techniques of jungle warfare and survival, just as he had been taught before he had been sent off to kill. So my annotation here is covert ops in Vietnam. Richard Ramirez linked to Anton LaVey as well. This time, though, he traveled by San Francisco where he was granted a rare one-on-one meeting with High Priest Anton LaVey, where he attended a church of satanic ritual. Ramirez, who as a young man frequently slept in a local cemetery, was reportedly a big fan of LaVey's satanic Bible. Yeah, no shit. Strangely, though, there's no indication that any charges were filed against him around this time. And that's something else that comes up with Jeffrey Dahmer. We'll get into it here. We're getting towards the tail end of this book. So before we get to that, we talked a little bit about the Catcher in the Rye, and sort of like that's like sort of like the Assassin's Bible. But my annotations here it says Leonard Lake's The Collector book as Catcher in the Rye-esque psyop and Lake's vision of Armageddon. So oftentimes these assassins or sometimes these serial killers will have like they'll have like what they call esoteric Bibles. Like the guy that killed John Lennon was obsessively reading Catcher in the Rye for some odd reason, things that make you go hum. So let's see if we can find that little thing about Jeffrey Dahmer here. But anyway, before we get into it, Jeffrey Dahmer was... Okay, this is kind of strange here. Again, a lot of like... My annotation says Del Salvo and Dahmer and Heidnik all have military connections in West Germany. A lot of times, I think Dahmer himself and Jarek Heidnik, and who's this other killer? Frank De Salvo, or maybe it's Albert De Salvo. They went over to Germany or to Vietnam, involved in the Phoenix program. They all have military sort of training. He's talking about Albert De Salvo here. He says he was again honorably discharged. Much of the 7.5-year stretch was served in West Germany, where Gary Heidnik was subjected to MK Ultra experimentation not too many years later, and where Jeffrey Dahmer later served as well. So there's a weird covert military base in West Germany that has been frequented by many serial killers. While in Germany, Albert reportedly mastered the art of hand-to-hand combat and became a boxing champion. So just a little bit weird, if these serial killers are just like really stupid people, how are they able to, it's mind-boggling. talks a little bit about, with assistance from CIA-connected hypnotist William Jennings Byron III, who was brought on board by Bailey on the spring equinox. He's talking a little bit about the control of Candy Jones, mind control courier, possible assassin, some interesting stuff there. Then he gets into Arthur Shawcross, which was pretty darn interesting. Arthur Shawcross ended up in Vietnam and participated in the Phoenix program, and he confesses to it. Arthur Shawcross began his military service that would soon take him into the jungles of Vietnam and, by his own accounting, transform his life. But before he even left the States, Arthur reportedly went AWOL, a transgression for which he strangely suffered no repercussions. He described himself as a predator and a ghoul. This was all, prior to when he started committing crimes in and around Rochester, New York. Upon his return from Vietnam, he suffered blindingly painful headaches, and he was treated by an Army psychiatrist. He was stationed at Fort Hill, Oklahoma, where he was assigned to train recruits and set up exhibits of weapons for military shows. Uncle Sam apparently thought quite highly of the man, who once explained that if you roast human flesh until it is well done, you can then snack on it for several days. So just weird. That's like the third or fourth serial killer that participated in the Phoenix program. Things that make you go, something to think about. So Texas, primarily Texas serves as like a sort of like a prison industrial complex. Everybody knows about how large the prisons there, the sort of the ratio of the population that's locked up in Texas. The state of Texas is now the proud owner of what has been described as the largest prison system in the history of the world. Texas incarcerates its citizens as double the rate of the rest of the nation, which is quite a startling statistic when one considers that the country as a whole has the second highest incarceration rate of any nation, and in absolute numbers, the United States has the world's largest prison population. Texas also hosts far more executions than any other state, nearly as many, in fact, as other states combined. The most prolific of all serial killer chroniclers is undoubtedly Ann Rule, the former employee of the Seattle Police Department. Rule is best known for her first book, an account of the alleged crimes of Ted Bundy, entitled The Stranger Beside Me. The veteran crime director had a unique perspective on the Bundy case, given that she was not writing about some enigmatic figure, but rather someone whom she had cared for 10 years, someone she referred to as my friend, Ted Bundy. Perhaps it is just a bizarre coincidence that the investigative journalist working on the biggest story of her career happened to be a friend and sometime co-worker of the man who would ultimately be held responsible for the 6-year string of killings that she was researching. Even Rule, though, has acknowledged that the long-shot odds of such a coincidence occurring logically, statistically, demographically, the chance that Ted Bundy and I should meet and become fast friends is almost too obscure to contemplate. Yeah, no shit, Ann Rule. Equally bizarre is that the two live strangely parallel lives. Rule acknowledges that even before the time that she claims that they first met, she and Ted had lived in the same state at the same time, not once but many times. So was Ann Rule sort of a covert researcher for Ted Bundy, sort of helping to create the Ted Bundy myth, right? When they did allegedly meet in 1971, a few years before the killings began, it was both while working as counselors at the Seattle Crisis Clinic. Why were they both working there? That's weird. Interestingly, a number of cult defector survivors have claimed that such services are frequently infiltrated by cult members so that they may be used as cult recruitment tools. Not surprisingly, those contemplating suicide are particularly vulnerable to recruitment by cults. So they're saying, essentially what he's saying is that when these people, that's why I don't recommend people call crisis hotlines or do any of that online, better help and stuff, because those are not in all cases, but in some cases they function as sort of cult recruitment centers. They want to see who the broken people are. They want to see who the suicidal people are. They want to see who the deviant, violent people are. And that's kind of why we have the whole psychiatry industry to a certain degree, is a form of sort of latent observation / spying on this public citizens. They got all your records, all that kind of stuff. He does get into the JonBenet Ramsey case, which is this little chapter that I read in here kind of got me really interested in the JonBenet Ramsey case again, which will never be solved because they don't want it to be solved. Obviously, they'll every 10 years they'll say they'll give so and so an interview, whether it's Burke or Patsy's dead now, but in 10 years they'll probably grill John Ramsey again, or CNN will put up an article saying, oh, there's a new suspect in state prison that confessed. Maybe he's the killer. And then 2 weeks later, they'll say, oh, no, he's not the killer. And then we'll just have to keep hearing about it forever and ever because, interesting, just another connection here. John Ramsey is the son of a World War II pilot who later served as director of the Michigan Aeronautics Commission, where he was known, certainly not affectionately, as Czar Ramsey. John himself serves as a naval officer and pilot in the Philippines in the late 1960s. He later formed a company that he named Access. So just weird. JonBenet Ramsey's father just so happens to be in the military, of course. So Boulder, Colorado is pretty sketchy. There's a lot of human trafficking there. It's one of the headquarters for the the beauty pageants that JonBenet was involved in. So obviously they never found the culprit, but it's pretty obvious that it was probably one of the parents. The Ramseys were, very, very wealthy. You can sort of speculate that the way that the media just automatically jumped on the JonBenet Ramsey case, it's uncanny. We've never seen anything quite like that. And, whose pockets were being lined with the death of JonBenet just really makes you wonder. Only a family member would have likely known of its existence. He's talking about where they found the body. John Ramsey acknowledged the fact that in a CNN interview, the room that we found her in is kind of a remote part of the basement. Yeah, no crap, John Ramsey. So just really interesting stuff. Talks about how the whole operation was botched by the Ramsey family and the sketchy suicide note. Who leaves a 3 or 4 page ransom note? That just never happened in the history of the country. The worst crime in the history of the country. It's just never happened before. If you look at what people are saying now, it's pretty obvious that the mother wrote the ransom note. Numerous powerful people had been in and around the Ramsey home and had been exposed to JonBenet. Many of those powerful people were in the Ramsey home just 2 days before JonBenet's death and the night that the first 911 call was placed. It is very unlikely that any of these people will ever be named, but it is quite possible that some of them were public officials who opted to step away from the limelight. Very strange. What really happened to JonBenet Ramsey on that fateful day in 1966? Again, we're quoting from Dave McGowan's Program to Kill. And why did the case become such a cause célèbre? After all, the killing of a child in this country is certainly not an uncommon occurrence, nor is it normally an event deemed worthy of national media attention. And that's what we were saying before, like the 90s, it was just weird. Everywhere you looked, it was JonBenet Ramsey. And who, like I said, obviously the media companies, the news, the magazine articles, the tabloids, they made millions of dollars off of this. And I suspect the Ramseys also made millions off of this. They wrote a book. As the Village Voice reported in 1977, the United States has per capita the highest rate of child homicide. People like Adam Walsh. What then are we to make of the JonBenet Ramsey case? The family would like you to believe that was nothing more than a badly botched kidnapping plot. That hardly seems likely, however. The kidnapping scenario was most likely conceived after the fact to cover up the accidental or intentional death of the child. John Ramsey himself made sure that he was the one to make the discovery, thereby compromising the crime scene and nullifying any forensic evidence linking him to the body. None of that, however, of course, answers the question of why JonBenet Ramsey was killed. One theory holds that Patsy Ramsey killed JonBenet in a fit of rage resulting from a bedwetting incident. While that scenario is not necessarily absurd, as the Ramsey have labeled it, it does not seem to fall short of adequately explaining the crime. Other theory holds, obviously, that JonBenet was accidentally killed her during ongoing abuse. Apparently, there's no specific evidence pointing to the fact that he was an abuser, but then I've heard other articles stating that he was. So just that's a very strange case to add to the mix. And then, lastly but not leastly, the last portion of the book. Thank you for hanging in there, y'all. Going a little over an hour here. He gets into the Marquis de Sade, which is pretty interesting. They made a movie about him with Kate Winslet, just kind of scratching the surface of how deviant he was. And my last annotation to kind of sum all this up: poor law enforcement and media, well, I should say poor law enforcement operations in collusion with media coverage, or maybe botched or false media coverage, almost always coincides with the botched crime scenes. Like the media will sort of develop or follow false leads, like they did with the JonBenet Ramsey case, like they often do with serial killers. And obviously, the law enforcement. I mean, it would be hard to believe that law enforcement agencies are so unorganized that they could just allow for so many of these cases, the sheer number of them that were botched or were just mishandled from the beginning. I mean, obviously, police officers on an individual basis, they're humans, they make mistakes. I understand that, groups, enterprises make mistakes on their own, but just the sheer amount of negligence, I should say, that's sort of allowed and that's never questioned. It just makes you think that somebody is trying to cover their trails or trying to buy time so that other people can go off and do what they do, like the serial killers. So thank you so much for watching this live stream. Make sure you guys share the replay on your community post. I would appreciate that. If you have anything to add, Jared says, this book had a massive impact on me when I read it in our early 20s. Rest in peace, Dave. He was a real one. Yeah, definitely. I'd be curious to read some of his other works. But I would definitely say these are probably the best ones that these are the only ones that I've read that he's written. And I found this one just to be, although it was more dense, it was just a little more interesting. This one was pretty interesting too. But I don't know, just some of it he was talking a lot about musicians I'd never heard of and stuff like that. But very, very unique researcher. I'm glad that we got some other people out there familiar with Dave McGowan. So shout out to y'all. Really appreciate y'all spending a little bit of your, I don't even know what day it is. What is it? Monday night with us. We're getting off to a good start. We do have some interesting previous streams. We got the one we did with Candace about As I Lay Dying, William Faulkner. We did Marilyn Monroe Covert Operations, focusing on Mike Rothmiller's account of the death of Marilyn Monroe. So make sure you guys check out that. And I'll probably our next live stream or our next literature video is probably going to be Anna Karenina. We got some Leo Tolstoy coming up. We're getting through the tail end of Anna Karenina. We're reading an interesting biography. So we'll probably dovetail a little bit from the sort of covert operations conspiracy stuff until we read another book like that, and then we'll get back into it. But I do want to get back into the literature stuff. We'll talk a little bit about the Bible. We're going to be talking a little bit about William Faulkner again. I'm going to start reading some Ernest Hemingway. So we got some really interesting things in the works for y'all. If you guys want to, sort of sponsor some type of a stream or just recommend something, feel free to reach out to me on Cash App at In-Depth Literature. Send me like, $20-$30 or whatever. I'll buy a book. Send me $5-$10. I'll probably still read it. But if it's a book I don't have, it costs money to buy books and stuff. So if you guys want to sponsor some type of a stream or just suggest something, let me know in the comments. Send me an email at andrewmarlowe22@gmail.com, and we'll definitely, get some more things under our belt. So shout out to y'all. We'll see y'all next time.